Hey y'all, welcome to the Clock Tower. I'm Colton here with Brandon. Our final show of 2020. The year's almost over. We did our year in review last time. Link in the description of that if you missed that, where we talked about all of the sets and all the events from 2020. Looking forward now, a couple of releases on the horizon that we want to talk about. Not much news here at the end of the year to get to. The only real notable thing is from the new Magia Record anime set that is set to launch in April, and it has to do with the SPs in the set, Brandon.
It does. Like you mentioned, it's coming out in April. April 23rd is the date. With the announcement of the date, they also put out there that they're kind of changing some of these SPs. They're not changing the content of the SP, but rather the signature stamp that they put on them. They have not explained why, but other than the fact that they have. So if you were expecting the same signature stamp from JP to English, prepare to be surprised.
Pivoting off of the normal signature that we see onto something a little more simple.
It's also worthy to mention that it's only been announced for this specific set. That it's not a change that they look to have going forward.
Doesn't seem like this is a long-term thing. Seems like it's only for this set for some reason. So it looks like overall there are going to be 10 of these affected, 2 from the trial deck, 8 from the booster pack. And again, no other changes. This is purely an aesthetic change, but still worth knowing, still worth mentioning. If you're getting SPs for the new Magia Record anime set, now you know. So moving on, the next set that will be released by Bushiroad is Fate Grand Order Babylonia. So that set will be dropping January 22nd. It will be the first set of 2021. The notable thing here is that while it does have the Fate name, it is not playable with the rest of the Fate sets. It's more like Apocrypha and less like Heaven's Feel. So it can only be played with its own set. You cannot play this with other Fate stuff, whether it be main series or Apocrypha or anything like that. And the SPs for this set are particularly awesome. I'm hoping to pull the Mosh SP out of prize packs at locals.
So yeah, with that coming out in the next year, we're looking forward to it. We're looking forward to seeing that in our locals.
Yeah, there will be cases of that purchased at our locals, so we'll be seeing some of that as well. So that's Grand Order Babylonia. And as far as news goes, that's pretty much it. But seeing as how this is the last show of the year, and how it was kind of a quiet couple of weeks, and we're also recording this more ahead of time than we normally do just because of the holidays. So if something happens in the last week of December and we aren't talking about it, it's because we recorded this before it happened. Hopefully nothing catastrophic happened, but if the world did in fact end, sorry, there's nothing we can do about it. Given that this is the last show of the year and that there isn't a whole lot else to talk about, we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about what makes Weiss work and just why we're playing this game as opposed to other games. Brandon and I kind of have been having conversations about this, and I wrote down a list of reasons why I think Weiss is a great game. And Brandon and I talked about this, and we're basically on the same page with this. So
To kind of lead into that discussion, I kind of want to give you guys our perspective on this, talk about a little bit of where we come from, to be able to point to these things that we have found throughout our time with Weiss.
yeah,
And why we like Weiss so much. Enough to be able to even do this.
I mean, I've been playing card games for years, and this is the first time I've, forayed into YouTube over it.
Right? So, Colton, do you want to talk about where you've come from to be able to help explain where we're going with this conversation?
Sure. I played on the fringes of competitive Pokemon for a couple of years. I wasn't very good, but I played. I played a lot, and I enjoyed it. Stopped playing that after a couple of years and moved strictly into casual play. I've also played a little bit of Magic, not competitive, mostly Commander. But yeah, card games have been a part of my life for a long time, and when they became a part of my life, they became an important part of my life. But no game has really captured my attention as much as Weiss has. I find it to be more enjoyable than any other game that I've played. Weiss isn't my first game. It's realistically my third, I guess. But only the second one that I've played competitively, and definitely playing this with much more intentionality than I was Pokemon. What about you, Brandon?
So, kind of from a similar story, I played Magic and Pokemon prior to this one. Neither of those I played directly competitive. I did play against competitive people that actually did go to competitions and play competitively in both of those formats. I spent the time learning competitive gameplay from them without actually going into it myself. Weiss is really my first real dive into the competitive format, partly because it was the first time I actually had time to be able to do that,
Heard that.
if we're being honest.
That's a whole thing.
Yeah. So with the time able to dedicate to it, and with the appreciation of anime leading into that, to give it a little bit more of that connection, I think we decided about the same time to go headfirst in together.
Yeah, that's one of the things that, Weiss being a less popular game on the whole, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to dive in as an individual, just because you need people to play with, right? And, locals can be hard to find. When we started this, I don't think either of us thought it would be worth the investment unless we knew we had someone that we could play with on a regular basis. So it was more like, hey, if you do this, I'll do this. And we'll jump in and we'll start buying cards and, seeing what we wanted. Like, I knew Weiss existed for a while, but I didn't really do anything with it. I was like, no one plays this game. It's very niche. And I think I had an inflated view of how expensive it was compared to other card games. I won't have anyone to play with. It won't be worth my time. But when Brandon and I started talking about it, we were like, okay, well, this game, which exists, if we jump in, we're going to do this together so that we have someone else to play this game with. And then we just kind of went from there. We found our locals, which is actually pretty much equidistant between the two cities where we live. So we started going there with some regularity. And yeah, we've just been playing ever since. And now we have a channel.
COVID does a lot to you.
Yeah, it was definitely a pandemic decision, but now we're here, and it's been fun. It honestly has been a lot of fun.
Now that we kind of looked at how we kind of got into this, answering the question why we like Weiss, let's kind of actually flush that out a little bit of like, why do we like it? Why is Weiss Schwarz a great TCG?
Why is Weiss Schwarz a great TCG? I think there are a lot of reasons. When we started prepping for this episode, I asked myself that question. I'm like, okay, why do I like this? So I wrote a bunch of things down. And Brandon and I had the conversation, beforehand, okay, how do we want to approach this conversation? And there are a lot of things about Weiss that I think makes it a superior TCG to other games. First reason why Weiss is a great game is also, I think, the thing that gets most of us to play. And that is the diverse set of characters and IPs that are available to play with. For me, I was like, oh my gosh, I can build a Saber deck. I was like, wait, I can play cards, and on the cards, I can have Saber. That's awesome. Where do I sign up? That was the initial hook for me. But then as you move along, you realize that it's not just that the characters' names and faces are on the cards. In a lot of cases, especially with more the action adventure type of stuff, the way that the cards interact with each other is so flavorful and correlates so well to what the characters are like in their stories. And you can tell that these cards and these interactions are designed by people who care about those stories and characters, because their interactions are just so flavorful. Like with the Gurren Lagann set, where you literally just build a massive mech in the middle of the field, or with the new Mob Psycho set, where Mob is supporting Regan from the back row, basically giving him his power. In Fate Apocrypha, with the 3 cards in level that can be flipped over essentially as command seals with the level 1 archer to summon characters from your waiting room. There's so much flavor, and that is just one of the things that continues to make this game so much fun to play, because when you are playing a character down on the field, you're not just playing a card that has an interaction. It feels like you're actually doing something that is unique to that character.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. That flavor, I think, shines through in ways that it doesn't necessarily do so in some of the sets we've played with before.
Mm-hmm. There's some of that in Pokemon.
You have some of that. You have the evolution kind of idea, but even then, you have all of the mechanics that are trying to change that stuff around. You can use different colored energies for the different types of Pokemon, blending it a little bit.
if I took this Pokemon and I took all of the numbers and the attributes and abilities on this Pokemon and I just put it onto a different card, would I notice? Would it make a difference? I think in most cases it wouldn't. But in Weiss, you can tell that the mechanics have been chosen very intentionally, not for the sake of a power level, but for the sake of kind of telling the story. I think that's fantastic. And especially with stories and characters that you're already invested in, like most people want to pick up a set based on something they've seen before, right? Whereas when you buy into Magic, you have to buy into a new world, which is fine. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but you don't come in caring about Jace and Chandra. You know what I mean? You don't care about these characters that are in this Magic universe before you start playing Magic. With Weiss, the initial hook is that you already care. You're already invested. Pokemon has this element a lot more than like Magic does, but I think Weiss has it to an extent that even Pokemon doesn't really, just because they're very unique properties, whereas Pokemon is kind of like a larger brand. Weiss is picking and choosing these different stories from across like the broader anime manga landscape.
Yes.
So you're not just into Pokemon. You know, if you're into Fate, you can play Weiss. If you're into Konosuba, you can pick up Weiss. If you're into AOT, you can pick up Weiss. Whereas Pokemon is just one franchise. This is not to downplay Pokemon as a franchise. It's a great franchise. Don't get me wrong. And we'll get into whether or not it's a great card game. But as far as titles and flavor and characters and all that, Weiss has so many options, so many choices. It's the initial hook for the game, and I think it's one of the things that keeps people as well. The next thing, though, when I started playing Weiss, it was like, okay, this is fun because I get to play with these characters, but then this is the thing that made me think, oh, this is actually like, this solves a lot of the problems that other games have, and that is the Neo Standard format. It does a couple of key things. One is that the format itself is long-term rather balanced. Where it sits right now is really solid. The top 8 decks at Invitationals were all different, and AOT wasn't in that top 8. And, at the last Worlds, we had 5 different decks. At any given time, like especially right now, if you were to ask what's the best deck in the meta, in the English meta, there are at least 4 or 5 different answers that are valid and viable. You could say that it's still AOT, or you could say it's the new Konosuba. You could say it's the old Konosuba. You could say it's ReZero. You could say it's Fate. There are multiple answers. You could even say Slime. And all of those answers are viable. Like you can have disagreements or whatever, but none of those answers are bad answers. And this is the part where we get comments saying, oh, no, Slime is definitely not the best deck. Whatever. The point is, we can have the conversation. And I think that's one of the things that makes this work. I think that's one of the reasons that we have such a diverse meta. And then on top of that, not only is the format diverse, it's also stable, if that makes sense. Not only can you make any deck work if you put the labor into it, if you put enough time and energy into a bad set, you can still get a playable deck that can win some games. But not only that, when you have a set, there is no constant need to update it with chase cards. With Magic and Pokemon, new stuff's coming out with Magic it feels like it's every 2 weeks at this point. But every time some new set is announced or released, there's something to chase that is necessary if you want to put it into a competitive deck. With Weiss, it's not like that, because you literally can't mix these sets. So when Konosuba drops, you buy into Konosuba, and that's all you buy into for the sake of that deck. You might buy into an update later. You might buy into another set in a year or 2. But you don't have to chase cards with every single release to keep your deck relevant. Konosuba is going to remain relevant just because it's a good deck and it's well designed, not because you have to keep updating it by tracking down $30, $40, $50 cards with every new release. So I think that stability is really nice, especially because the cards also tend to hold their value for a while. If you buy into a set, your cards don't suddenly tank in value after a few months. They tend to hold on to their value for a while. Cards that are, rare from a few years ago are still worth something. So it's not like, if you buy into the standard meta in Pokemon or Magic, you buy into these cards when they're very expensive, and then a few months later they're worth almost nothing. Whereas in Weiss, even the rare cards from the old sets that aren't even played, they're still collector's items. There's still enough demand for those that they maintain some of that value.
I mean, also with this format, the fact there's not a rotation of cards, that there aren't cards that fall out of the list. If you want to bring your Fate Zero deck, you can bring your Fate Zero deck.
Literally the best thing about this format to me is the fact that cards don't rotate. You never have to stop playing your stuff. When I buy Haruhi, when I spend hundreds of hours and hundreds of dollars on a Haruhi deck that is very old, I never have to worry about, oh man, rotation's coming, worrying about if it's going to get hit, or even if I know it's going to get hit, when it's going to move out into either a big format that I can't compete in or just straight up oblivion. None of that with Weiss. You can play your stuff, you can play your cards basically forever. They won't necessarily be good because there's been a pretty gentle, upward curve in terms of power, which is expected. That's how card games work. So they're not necessarily going to be competitive, but I'm still allowed to play them. I can bring Haruhi to locals, and there aren't questions about format. You just bring your cards. It's super nice.
And that's partly why we've been so attached with the English side of the game as well. The lack of a ban list.
Yep.
So, if English was to get a ban list, I don't think that would stop us from playing in English.
Well, no. If you're a Magic player, you know the stress of the ban list, right? If you play in Standard or Modern, even if you care what the Rules Committee says, you listen to what they have to say about Commander bans. The stress of wondering if your stuff is going to get hit, because if it gets hit, not only are you not allowed to play your cards, they lose all their value, because no one else can play them. Or at the very least in certain formats, right? So that's frustrating. It's frustrating to buy into a thing only to be told this is literally against the rules for you to play. With Weiss, there's not that issue. And the ongoing question, should there be a ban list? I feel like my position on that's pretty well stated. I'm generally very anti-ban list. Mostly because I've seen what happens to other card games, right? I remember playing Pokemon and people hoping that certain cards would get banned or restricted somehow. You wonder, that kind of just hangs over your head. Is this $20 card that I have to have a playset of in my deck or something, is it going to get hit? And that sucks. That's not fun. And even aside from that, when Weiss does do banning and restricting, very rarely in the JP side of things do they outright ban things. Usually it's just some kind of restriction. You can play this or this, which means that your cards aren't completely worthless. They're just not allowed to be used together, which, if you're going to have a ban list, is, in my opinion, the superior way to implement it. So obviously with Data Live coming out, Data Live is a set that has some pretty heavy restrictions in JP, coming into English unrestricted. A lot of conversation about whether there will be a ban list, whether there should be a ban list. So it's possible that this point might not hold into 2021. But as of right now, there's no ban list. And that's something that I know both of us have appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
So the last thing on the format of Weiss, this feels like a relatively minor thing, but for me, it's important. As someone who cares very deeply about people having access to things, the fact that qualifying for Worlds is essentially open is fantastic. How do you get to Worlds in Pokemon? And it's hard. It's a grind. You have to go to a bunch of events, accumulate X number of points to get in. With Weiss, there's nothing like that. You show up to the event costs you nothing, and if you win a regional, you're going to Japan. It's that simple. That's impressive. It's incredible. It reminds me of what I think is the best event in all of sports, which is the NCAA tournament, the men's basketball tournament that takes place every March. It's an incredible event, but one of the reasons that it's such a good event is because on March 1st, everyone in the entire country has a chance to make that tournament. The way that you get into that tournament is you win your conference tournament. You could have lost every game up to that point, but if you start playing good basketball in March and you win your conference tournament, no matter how big or little your conference is, you're in. And Weiss parallels that. You want to go to Worlds, you win a regional. And I think that format makes a lot of sense. And I think that it gives new players the chance to immediately start thinking about, oh, well, if I can show up to this tournament for free, closest thing I have to a local regionals, wherever the closest one is, I can show up to this tournament and potentially win it and go to Worlds. Like, it's unlikely. The potential is there for any player who plays this game to win a chance to go to Worlds. And I think that that's exactly the perfect way to do it. As small of a thing as it might seem to be, it cuts out a lot of the issues with qualifying for major tournaments and other TCGs, like Pokemon and Magic, and instead democratizes it and says, you get in if you win. Straight up. It's as simple as that. You don't need to go through any complex formulas. You don't need to attend dozens of events. Just show up and win. And I think that's really powerful.
I think that low barrier to entry, especially, I think helps with the new person coming in. Because if you give that new person saying, hey, look, you have that opportunity to be able to reach that top spot, I think it is able to inspire people to not only continue playing, but to continue that path on that drive to reach that point. You're not telling the new person, oh, well, if you just show up, you can win. But you're giving them the opportunity to saying, hey, if you put in the time and effort, you can do well, and you have at least the opportunity.
I think that's great. And like you said, there's a clear delineation in other TCGs between the casual and the competitive players. In Weiss, anyone can theoretically be a competitive player if they're willing to put the time and effort into crafting their deck and building something good and then taking it to a major event. Anyone can have that opportunity to be a Worlds level player. They get there by becoming good enough at the game to win a major event, which is a hard thing to do. I don't want to say that that's not a very difficult thing. It is a difficult thing, but it's also a very straightforward thing.
Yes. And the kind of like the format of like the game itself. But let's go actually look more at the details of the game, Colton, just for a few minutes.
Right. Those things that we've been talking about are more about like the structures of the game, the things that get people to play it initially, the places you can go with it, things like that. Now it's time to get to the actual playing of the game. There are things that this game does with the cards that are on the field and in your hand that are better than the other games. And it starts from the very first turn of the game. Brandon, I've been saying this ever since I started playing Weiss. I've said this, and I believe it so strongly. Weiss has the best Mulligan system in card games. The best I've ever seen. If you dead draw in Pokemon, you don't have a basic Pokemon in hand, your opponent gets advantage every time you brick because they get to draw a card. In Magic, if you brick, you have to not only shuffle back in, you draw one fewer card. You do that twice, and you're screwed. You've lost so much advantage that it's so hard to come back. With Weiss, you draw 5, you keep what you want, pitch what you don't want, and draw up again. There's so much strategy that goes into your decisions at the Mulligan. You can decide, based on what you have in hand, how hard do you want to push to try to pull your level 1 combo? You know? How do you have the pieces in hand to set up your combo? Do you have the pieces in hand to set up your level 0 board? You can make those decisions and hold on to the pieces that you need.
With the Mulligan system that we have, from the beginning of the Mulligan to up through the initial clock draw, there is the potential to go through about 13 cards.
Absolutely.
Which is about 1/4 of the deck.
If you are playing an older deck that crutches hard on its level 1 combo and you need to find a way to get that level 1 combo into your hand, by the time you have drawn and clocked off of your second turn, you could see as many as 16 cards in your hand. And that doesn't include any other plussing effects. as someone who, likes playing those older sets, the mere ability to be able to pitch 5 to chase my climax combo. Like, not saying that that's what you want to do all the time, but like the fact that I have that option is fantastic.
Well, I mean, the fact that you are able to get through a fourth of your deck in that first turn before you even play cards to field.
And that's a strategic choice.
It gives you the opportunity to get you cards to begin moving through your deck.
Yeah.
It gives you the opportunity to be able to play, really,
yeah.
to kind of prevent that kind of bricking process that you can see with Pokemon or Magic.
And not only do you get to choose more effectively the cards that you have in hand to start the game, to let you actually play the game, which is what we're here for. If you brick and you lose because you brick, that just sucks. No one enjoyed that. Like, your opponent won, sure, but no one had fun with that. If you have the opportunity to get cards in hand that you actually want, now the mulligan isn't just a way to start the game, it's now, in and of itself, a strategic element. Before a card has even been drawn or played onto the field, you're making decisions about how you want to play your game. It gives you more control over the game as a player. It doesn't just give you an opportunity to fix a bad opening draw, it gives you an opportunity to set the strategy for how you want to play the rest of your game. It's a superior system, and I mean, maybe there are other mulligan systems that are better out there. I've never seen one. And that moves kind of into the next thing, which is access to your cards. One of the things that I like the most about Weiss is that you can't mill out and die. Not because I don't think milling is a fair strategy. Like, if you want to play mill in Magic or Pokemon, by all means go for it. Like, that's a valid strategy. It's a fair strategy. But I like the fact that in Weiss, if I pitch a card, I will have access to that card again later. The deck's going to get reshuffled. I have cards that let me have access to my waiting room. I have cards that let me have access to my deck. I even have cards that let me have access to my clock. The only zones that are really unreachable are the level zone and memory, both of which, in the vast majority of cases, if I put a card there, it's my choice. There aren't a whole lot of cards that memory kick your opponent's card. There aren't a ton of those. And even the ones that do exist, usually they happen at like level 3 in the end game. So you have a lot more control over where your cards are. You have access to your cards pretty consistently, unlike in, say, Pokemon, where off the top, the first thing you do after you draw your hand is you immediately set aside 6 cards and say, I don't get to play with those at the start of the game. And I also don't know what they are. So on your first turn, you're intentionally trying to play something that lets you search your deck, only to figure out what cards you don't have access to. In Weiss, there's no mystery. You see every card as it goes to stock, unless you're playing a blind stock, which is, again, a strategic choice. If you choose to sacrifice some of your own information, that's a choice that you make when you're building the deck, or when you're playing the deck. You know where everything is. You have access to pretty much every zone on the field. And there's never a time when you pitch a card and say, I will never see that card again. Because there's always some kind of mechanic, either refreshing or waiting room access or something that lets you get things and lets you play the game. I think that's going to be the theme that we're going to keep coming back to with this conversation is Weiss lets you play the game. The mechanics of Weiss let you play Weiss.
Yeah, kind of along that idea with the mulligan, trying to rejuvenate that opportunity to be able to again play on a relatively equal footing. Within the game of Weiss, there really is this comeback mechanic that seems to exist within the game. It's much more difficult to blow out your opponent. Like, the game itself seems to try to have this kind of back and forth kind of competition, which is very similar to what you would see in anime. You kind of get the, I punch this guy, oh wait, he takes the hit and he punches me back harder kind of thing.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of it in that light, but no, that makes a lot of sense. It is, in and of itself, also kind of this flavorful approach.
If we look at the game of Weiss itself, the game of Weiss is really a stage performance.
It is
what the kind of like the intended idea was.
It really is. It's meant to be bombastic.
You're telling your story of your anime through card game. And you're kind of doing like it in a competition way as to which one's going to win the competition. Which is why they use stage direction as an idea of lanes.
Yeah, the game is a performance. You're supposed to be playing the story out. And, I mean, we already talked about flavor, so we don't need to get into this too far. But, like, is there a more flavorful thing in Weiss than playing Review Starlight and putting a character down onto the stage. Playing Review Starlight literally onto the stage of Fate. I don't know if there's a more flavorful thing in all of card games than that moment. But yeah, like you said, there is a built-in comeback mechanic. This is honestly, when we started playing this game, one of the first things we noticed was, oh, when I punch you, you literally get stronger.
Mm-hmm.
And it lets me play stronger things. Other games aren't like that. In Magic, you can turn a lead into something insurmountable by carrying through the natural progression of things. With Pokemon, when you get a knockout, you get cards into hand by adding those prize cards into your hand. So it's in those games, snowballing is so much more natural. In this game, you literally cannot beat your opponent on turn 1. It is impossible, functionally. You are guaranteed some turns in this game. And if you fall behind, you're guaranteed access to bigger and better things. Now, granted, obviously getting pushed into a level before you have the resources is a whole thing.
Yeah, like there's still ways to overcome this comeback mechanic.
But it's designed, the game is intentionally designed, so that you're not out of it if you fall behind. Obviously, it's hard to come back. That's how games work. When you're losing by a lot, it's hard to come back and win. But in Weiss, there are ways to do it. You're not out of the game.
There are like thresholds within each level that make it more interesting and more difficult, more challenging to overcome. Mm-hmm. When you go into the next tier, being balanced as close as possible is the best way to overcome that.
And that's, I think that kind of goes into the next thing we wanted to talk about, which is that this game gives you better control over your own luck. Weiss's RNG components are more obvious to the naked eye than in other games, which I think leads a lot of people to wonder, is Weiss really just a game of luck? No, there is luck involved because it's a card game, but it's not a game of luck. And the reason it's not a game of luck, I would argue, is because this game, more so than other games, gives you control over your numbers. With other games, it's all about what you draw into hand. The luck is limited to what you draw, right? And if you dead draw, then you're kind of screwed in a lot of games. In Weiss, the more obvious luck mechanic is canceling. But you as a player get to make choices with your deck and with the cards that you play and the way that you play the game that lets you control how many climaxes are in your deck and how often you are likely to cancel. Everyone's been bitten by luck in this game and every card game. But the fact that what Weiss's primary luck mechanic, as it were, is not drawing. Because as we said, you have access to your cards. There are a lot of ways in Weiss to get the cards in hand that you need. But what you have to do is balance that with controlling the number of climaxes in your deck. Are you going to play a more aggressive game where you spend more resources and more cards are going into your waiting room and you're not spending resources fixing your compression to get the cards that you want so that you can get your big combo off? Or are you going to play defensively and focus on your compression at the expense of maybe having all the cards on field that you want? Instead of being strictly dependent on what you draw, now you have control over how you spend your resources. Now you have to make decisions that determine your odds in different parts of the game. You are, as a player, balancing all of these different factors and making decisions that basically trying to set up your game state so that you get the odds that you need or the odds that you want.
For me, I look at this kind of actually takes me back to actually the anime No Game No Life, where one of the main characters talking about a deck of cards says, what would be the probability of me drawing the ace of spades out of the deck? Normally that odds is like 1 out of 52, right? So like about 1.92%. But he says, but I didn't say a word about it being a new deck. Because if you take out the jokers and draw the card at the very bottom, he says it's the ace of spades almost 100% of the time. Being in the know gives you the power to turn the probability of winning from 1.92% to 100%. The more knowledge you have, the more likely you will be the victor. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really true with the game of Weiss.
Yeah, especially because Weiss offers all of its information on a platter. You know what I mean? Like, because you have almost perfect information about your own deck, you can make decisions based on all of that information. So I think the game is a lot less about luck and more about making decisions with information. Your information when you play Magic or Pokemon is much more flawed because there are fewer zones, you see fewer of your cards, your odds of hitting a certain thing, it's a lot more rote, right? You have to go and get the things that you want. Whereas with Weiss, you know your odds of drawing into something, you know your odds of canceling something. You have control over that to a certain extent. You can manipulate the numbers. It doesn't always work because there is that luck factor involved in even the act of manipulating those numbers. You can make informed decisions because you have the information necessary.
And I think that that's where the next step is that changeover from knowing about your own deck to knowing about your opponent's deck.
And Weiss also gives you a lot more information about your opponent than other games do. Like in Pokemon or Magic, you don't see a lot of what your opponent does other than what they put on the field. Or maybe what, ends up in their discard pile. With Weiss, you can count cards. You know where things are. You know how many climaxes a person has when they shuffle back into their deck. And you can track triggers and cards drawn and cards played and cards milled to know what your opponent's deck state is at, know generally what they have access to.
Like you can even tell pretty much what they have in their hand.
Yeah, a good player knows. A good player who knows what's in a deck, especially if they understand the meta and they know what, someone's 50 card list probably looks like, can probably tell you in a lot of cases down to the card what they have in hand just based on observing. Weiss is a lot more liberal with its information, and because Weiss is more liberal with its information, you as a player have more control, even if the randomness element of the game is a little more written on the tin than it is with other games. Because you have so many other elements that you have so much more control over, ultimately, I would argue that this game has less overall luck factor in it than others. Of course, there is luck. It's a card game, right? You will lose bad games. You will have bad beats, and you will win on some garbage. It will happen. It's a card game. Every card game works this way. But with Weiss, you have more control over the garbage than you do with other games.
Which is why, especially when coming in with a new player who doesn't recognize all of the information they have available, it can seem a lot more like luck has a higher role in that.
Yes. Any really good card player will tell you, no matter what the game, that information is, if not the most important resource in card games, it's at least one of the most important resources. One of the reasons that there's so much information to digest in Weiss is because of the way that it is set up mechanically with the actual words on the cards, which is kind of the next thing we want to talk about, the diversity of the mechanics of the game. This is one of those more interesting topics, I think, because on one hand, the fact that Weiss does not have keywords is a frustration. Not every brainstormer does the same thing. So many cards that have different effects on them they're similar effects, but they're slightly different. And that can be a frustration. Like, there's no one definition of Akatsuki, right? Like, what's an Akatsuki? Is it on death? Is it on play? Do you pitch first? Do you get a character first? Can you get something that isn't a character? They're all different.
Well, even that's a community term versus the actual terminology from the game itself.
We just took the name of a card that did this thing and have applied it to every other card that does something sort of similar.
Check out Pittsburgh's video on the kind of the community terminology that we use.
Link in the description. It's a great video. But that being said, while that can be a frustration, the fact that there are so many different ways to interact with your cards and for cards to move from zone to zone, I think is one of the strengths of the game. I kind of like it that not every top 4 check effect does the exact same thing. I think it's unique, and I think it's interesting. Like, the Ilya from Fate is on play, but plus is only master characters. The Wiz from Konosuba, it's an on-death effect, but you can add cards that are level 1 or higher, right? So you can add events into hand. The Frankenstein from Apocrypha that checks for basically any character in your deck, but only when it dies. There's a balance there. Those cards all have strengths and weaknesses, and learning to play around those strengths and weaknesses, in terms of the profiles, they're very similar cards, but they're different enough that it lets you play creatively and do things that are unique and different. If all those cards were exactly the same, then there wouldn't be as much of a difference between the sets. But the fact that the Wiz from Konosuba and the Ilya from Fate do things differently means that the whole set, all of the decks in the set, play differently because of that. And I think that that's interesting. I think that makes for a more interesting game than if every card did the same thing. And like obviously there are some cards that have almost exactly the same effects. One of my favorite profiles is the Ricky, but my favorite Ricky, and I mean this is just personal preference, is the one in Fate Apocrypha. And the reason that it's my favorite is because on play you can top check and surveil. Right? You can leave it on top or you can mill it. Because when you play a Ricky, you're clocking whatever the top card is when you pay the one to salvage something from waiting room or search or whatever. But in that case, I like that top check. That top check to me makes that Ricky so much more powerful because I'm not going to accidentally clock a climax or the card that I want to salvage. Little things like that, I think, make the game more interesting. And I might be more alone on that. I understand the desire for something more streamlined, something more consistent. That makes sense. I personally like the little differences. I think it makes the game more interesting. And then the last thing that I want to touch on is a very small thing, but it's something that I appreciate to no end, which is that the game itself is self-contained. There are no spin downs for life points. There are no dice on Pokemon that tell how much damage they have. There are no markers to determine what's confused or burned, or what has or doesn't have certain status effects. It's all self-contained. The cards keep track of damage. The cards either win or lose their battles. You literally just need a deck of cards to play this game. It's really straightforward. There are a couple of effects that a marker can help with, but they're not strictly necessary.
Yeah. You could have dice to mark off power based off of like assists and whatnot. Like you could.
But there also aren't so many cards on the field. Like we've all either played or seen a Magic game where there are so many tokens and artifacts and lands on the field, where it's like both players have 30 cards on the field, and it's a confusing mess. Weiss, there are 5 cards, maybe 6 when you throw it out a climax. It's pretty straightforward. You can, the math is pretty simple, and it's not hard to remember what all the cards, what effects all the cards have, because there are only a few cards on the field at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So I find that simplicity really nice. I like design that is straightforward and intuitive, and I think that the way that Weiss handles its damage and the way that Weiss handles its denoting of effects is simple and intuitive, and I like that.
Well, let's just throw out a question then. What do you guys like about this game? What keeps you here in Weiss?
Maybe what brought you here was a desire to play Attack on Titan, but something kept you around beyond that, probably.
I mean, you made it to our channel, so congratulations and welcome.
You made it to the end of this video. Look, if you are not only playing Weiss, but also watching our stuff, and also getting to the end of these kinds of videos, you clearly care about this game to some extent. We would love to hear what it is about this game that you like. And this is, by no means an exhaustive list. It feels exhaustive. There are so many reasons why this game is fun. I think there's something to be said for unironic, earnest praise of a thing that we enjoy. And that's what this is. This is unironic, earnest praise of a game that both Brandon and I have enjoyed and spent a lot of time on, especially this last year. Having a channel and everything. But it's been fun. And I don't think either of us have any plans to stop.
No, no, we are planning on continuing to keep going forward. We wanted to share with you why we enjoy the game, why we like Weiss, why we think Weiss is a great TCG.
Yep, and that's going to be the clickbait title, Why Weiss is a Great TCG.
As we kind of to wrap up and close up this clock talk
And this year.
and this year. So yeah, coming up next is going to be Colton's deck. We will find out what that is when he tells us.
It won't come to anyone's surprise that because I've been, kind of on a Konosuba kick, there will be more Konosuba, but this one's going to be a little different. It's going to be a little different. I believe I promised this profile at some point in the channel's history. If you go all the way back through and listen, I'm pretty sure I promised that I was going to make this deck at some point.
I think you did like 6 months ago.
As soon as I saw this card, I was like, I need to build around this. I have, and it works. And it's super fun, and I'm really looking forward to profiling this and finally showing the world this ridiculous deck. So it's gonna be fun. We'll see that one. That'll be the first deck profile of January, I believe. That'll be a week from today. We'll have open gameplay on Thursday, which I think is New Year's Eve.
I would agree. That is New Year's Eve.
Yep. So we'll have open gameplay on Thursday, my deck next Tuesday, and then gameplay for that the Thursday following. 2 weeks from now, we'll be back with another Clock Talk. And because it will have been a long time since we actually recorded a Clock Talk, I'm sure there will be something to talk about. Hopefully some updates on what 2021 might look like from Bushy Road. Fingers crossed on that. With vaccine distribution beginning, there may be an end in sight. So here's hoping that we get to play some cards soon.
In person, yeah.
In person, because as much as I love playing online, it's better in person. But until then, thank you for joining us. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, have a good one.
We'll see you then.